Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, with my final presentation on the Great Attacks, looking at Passchendaele, including Messines Ridge, and after it Cambrai. And don't forget my overriding questions, and those I've added for 1917. The appalling loss of life in the two offensives thus far in 1917, the French mutinies, and the fact that Austria-Hungary had sounded out whether a separate peace could be negotiated, all led Lloyd George to question the merit of another major assault. Churchill, back in the government as Minister of Munitions, but not in the War Cabinet, also called for caution. The Germans, he argued, were still too strong. They had more munitions and were dug into strong defences. Best to wait until the Americans would be ready in numbers large enough to make the difference. A strategy meeting at the beginning of May between Haig, Robertson, Nivelle, he would be sacked in a matter of weeks, and Pétain, had agreed that although they would stay on the offensive and the British would take the brunt of the strain, they would do so using artillery to maximum effect in order to limit the loss of life, and that they would limit their objectives using a bite and hold strategy. General Haig, however, was acutely aware of the serious trouble the French were in. The Germans had to be distracted, lest they overrun the French lines. He also believed that the Germans themselves were close to collapsing, though the collapse of Russia hadn't been expected, whilst the British were now more experienced fighters. Failures at the Somme and Vimy Ridge were down to the French insisting on fighting at the wrong points. One more push at the right point, and he had always been sure that Ypres was the right point, and the war would be over. Strategically, Haig seemed to have a point. If the ridges overlooking Ypres could be taken, the vital railway centre at Rouleau, vital for German supplies, and Ostend and Zeebrugge, from where U-boats sailed, could all be taken, and Belgium liberated. Besides, defending the Ypres salient had itself been a tremendous drain on the British. Preparations were helped enormously when the massive ridge at Messines, held by the Germans and overlooking the British lines, was taken. This assault began when almost 500,000 kilograms of explosives in 21 mines were blown. It was preceded by a 4-day bombardment with more than 2,200 guns, about a third of which were heavy guns, firing 3.5 million shells. Then there was a creeping barrage as the men attacked. And in a further refinement, artillery also targeted German strongpoints. And once these were destroyed and the German lines taken, the creeping barrage settled into a curtain barrage to protect the men in their new positions, with tanks and machine gunners firing over their heads, giving further support. All the British objectives were taken within a week of fighting, with more than 7,000 German prisoners and almost 50 guns, more than 200 machine guns and 60 mortars captured. But there was an unavoidable delay before the main attack, the Battle of Passchendaele, also known as the Third Battle of Ypres, as guns had to be hauled from the initial assault to the main show, and set on what firm ground could be found, whilst the weather also meant the planes couldn't reconnoitre the enemy's lines. So by the time the attack was launched, the bombardment of over 4 million shells lasting 15 days and with a gun every 6 meters, combined with the heaviest rain for decades, and made the battlefield a deadly, muddy swamp, so deep that men and horses drowned in it. Artillery guns and tanks sank out of sight. Not ideal for an assault. The German defences were also formidable. Defence in depth, with a thin front line on a low ridge, a second line on its reverse slope, difficult for the artillery to get at, and additional lines stretching back to Passchendaele Ridge, with the whole area further protected by concrete machine gun posts. And they had mustard gas. Haig had been warned of the difficult conditions, but declined to share them with the War Cabinet when he was called to a meeting to justify his offensive. Instead, he assured his political masters that there was a very good chance of victory by the end of the year. Still, he didn't guarantee a major breakthrough, and the assault he was planning allowed for the option of different aims once it was underway. A sustained barrage, this time with more than 3,000 guns, was again followed by a creeping barrage as the men attacked. But the German defences were strong and their men determined. Another battle of attrition was all that was in store. Haig accepted that he had to change his plans and opted for a bite and hold operation, also cancelling an amphibious landing that had been planned. The aim was to take the heavily defended approaches to Passchendaele Ridge and then take the ridge itself. Another massive barrage opened the attack, but this time just focused on one key sector. There would be almost 1,300 guns available, 575 of them medium or heavy guns, absolutely vital if the concrete machine gun posts and other fortified firing positions were to be knocked out. Light railways were laid to transport the millions of shells at least part of the way to the guns. The infantry was trained so that they would be able to respond on their own initiative. The first waves would draw the Germans' fire. Then platoons or sections would deal with the strong points. This was no longer the inflexible line of men advancing into a hail of bullets, but a well-trained, flexible force, able to deal with whatever they faced. The aim was to gain about 1,400 meters at a time, consolidate, and allow the artillery to regroup before pushing forward again, until they were in a position to attack the ridge. The British took heavy casualties with each push, but the tactic worked. Haig thought that the breakthrough he hoped for in his best-case scenario might yet be achieved. But as the rains came again in October, the battle for Passchendaele became not only a battle of attrition again, but a battle of wills. Haig was sure the Germans must be close to breaking, but the Germans were determined, and they called up more reserves in a desperate attempt to hold on. Passchendaele Ridge was taken in November, but there was no breakthrough. Haig's best-case scenario, seizing the railway centre and the Belgian ports, was always a matter of if everything went right for the British and wrong for the Germans. He had gained more ground, and strategically important ground, than was made in any other assault in the salient, and the French army had been relieved of concerted German pressure, and as a result was still in the fight. Bite and hold tactics had shown that it could take the best laid out German defence system and the most determined defence of what they held. But it was a limited tactic, very useful in gaining hold of a strategic point on the line, but alone it wasn't going to cause a breakthrough and win the war. And it came at a painfully heavy price. In total, the British, French and Canadians suffered between 250,000 and 400,000 casualties, of whom something like 66,000 had died. The Germans lost somewhere in the region of 200,000 to 400,000 men, either dead, wounded or taken prisoner. But what gains had been made were given back the following year, as the British shortened their line when the Germans attacked. However, a breakthrough in tactics did result from the wider battle at Cambrai, some 80 kilometres from Ypres. The attack opened with a predicted bombardment from 1,000 guns. That is, immediately before the attack, rather than a sustained preliminary bombardment, which sacrificed any element of surprise. It used reconnaissance and maps to ensure targets were hit. It was also called shooting off the map. It was also combined with upgraded tanks, almost 500, which deployed on firm ground en masse and in close formation could crash through the barbed wire, again doing away with the need for prolonged bombardment. The tank crews and the infantry had undergone training so that they were able to work together and maximize the power of the attack. Aeroplanes flew ahead of the advancing troops and tanks, strafing the German defences, a tactic that was beginning to be used more and more, and bombing their batteries. It was primitive and inaccurate, but it added to the panic amongst the defences, who now faced not just a terrifying bombardment, but tanks lumbering towards them, and attacks from the air. The tanks, big objects and slow-moving, were vulnerable to German artillery fire, and almost 180 of them were either taken out of action or else broke down. Nevertheless, the attack pushed through all three German lines and punched a hole in the German front some 6 or 7 kilometres wide and some 8 kilometres deep, all at little cost. Though when they tried to break through, the cavalry were torn to pieces by German machine guns, and the infantry couldn't keep pace. Without support, they couldn't seize the advantage they had gained, and the Germans pushed back. The chief strategic aims, the railway junction and the ridge, remained in German hands, while the salient that the British had created would prove very vulnerable to German attacks, and its tip was given up in order to have a better defensive line. Still, the combination of tank, infantry and air power had shown what it could do. What's more, the battles of 1917 had shown that the British and the French were learning and could penetrate the German defences, strong though they were. Also, the Germans were losing more men than they could afford to. It wouldn't have been noticeable on the battlefield, and clearly the long-suffering French soldiers didn't see any reason to be hopeful. But the tide was beginning to turn. But the British knew they still needed more firepower, as well as fresh recruits. And that's my lot for the great attacks. When weighing up the immediate pros and cons of whether they were successful or not, and I appreciate the scale of loss of life is a huge consideration, perhaps it should be set against the fact that war came to an end in 1918. So perhaps your ultimate question is, to what extent did the great attacks play a part in Germany's final collapse? I hope these presentations have been useful. If that's the case, do please subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already, and tell your friends about them. But for now, thank you so much for listening, and the very best of luck in your studies. Cheers.